The night she first corrected my name, I felt something inside me loosen like a knot I hadn't known I was carrying. I had loved her, before I understood myself, back when she was just the quiet woman at the end of the couch who listened more than she spoke and looked at me as if she were reading a subtitle beneath my sentences. She wore her difference lightly, like a coat she could take off or put on depending on the weather, and I mistook that grace for simplicity. I was wrong. Everything about her was deliberate, especially the way she saw me. At the time, I still thought of myself as a man who merely borrowed softness now and then. I told myself stories that were easy to swallow. I said it was curiosity, a private rebellion against a rigid world, a harmless experiment with fabric and posture and tone. I said it was temporary. I said many things that kept me intact. She never contradicted me outright. She just watched, and when I spoke, her eyes held a question mark that felt like a mirror. We met through a mutual friend at a small gathering that smelled like tea and old books. I remember the way her hands moved when she spoke, precise but gentle, as if every gesture had been practiced in front of a window. When she laughed, it wasn't loud. It arrived like a confession. I noticed, absurdly, how carefully she chose her words, how she allowed silence to finish sentences for her. I didn't yet know that this patience would become the architecture of my undoing. Weeks later, I found myself in her apartment, a space that felt curated but lived in, where nothing screamed for attention yet everything seemed intentional. There were framed photos on the wall, not of people, but of places, doorways, staircases, reflections in glass, thresholds. I sat on her couch, hands clasped, heart behaving like it had been summoned to a test it hadn't studied for. She offered me tea and asked, softly, why I always apologized when I took up space. The question startled me because it was true. I apologized when I sat, when I spoke, when I laughed too hard. I apologized for my shoulders, my voice, my presence. I shrugged, gave a practiced half-smile, and said I didn't know. She nodded as if that answer fit perfectly into a pattern she'd already mapped. It was that evening she noticed the bag. I had brought it without thinking, a habit formed from years of hiding things in plain sight. Inside were clothes I told myself were costumes. She didn't ask permission before opening it, but she didn't need to. She lifted a blouse, examined the fabric, then looked at me with a curiosity that felt neither judgmental nor indulgent. It felt expectant. "You don't wear these like someone playing dress-up," she said. Not a question, an observation. My throat tightened. I laughed it off, the way I always did, but the sound fell flat between us. She didn't push. She simply placed the blouse back, folded neatly, and closed the bag as if sealing an agreement I hadn't realized I was making. From then on, she began to speak to me differently. Not overtly, not in ways I could easily point to, but with subtle shifts that made my internal compass wobble. She commented on how my voice softened when I was relaxed, how my hands moved with more elegance when I wasn't thinking about them. She would tilt her head and say things like, "You seem more honest like this," when I sat with my legs tucked beneath me, or "That posture suits you," when I leaned in rather than sprawled back. I told myself she was simply perceptive. I told myself I was imagining the rest. The first time she asked me to try something on for her, it wasn't framed as a request. It was framed as a kindness. "You look so tense today," she said, opening her closet. "Let me help you unwind." There was nothing provocative in her tone, nothing that suggested spectacle. It felt like being offered a glass of water after a long walk. I hesitated, of course. My mind ran through its familiar objections, the ones that had kept me safe. But there was something in her calm certainty that made resistance feel unnecessary, almost childish. I changed behind a screen, my hands trembling as fabric slid over skin, every sensation amplified by the knowledge that this wasn't just for me. When I stepped out, she didn't smile. She studied me with an intensity that made my breath catch. "There you are," she said quietly. The words landed with unexpected weight. Not "you look nice," not "that fits," but a recognition that felt alarmingly complete. I felt seen in a way that both terrified and soothed me. She adjusted a sleeve, guided my shoulders back, and for a moment her hands lingered, not possessive but instructive, like a teacher correcting form. From that night on, the boundaries I thought I had built began to blur. She corrected my language gently, suggesting alternatives that felt strange on my tongue but right in my chest. She encouraged habits that emphasized care, attentiveness, grace. When I resisted, she didn't argue. She waited. Her patience was a quiet pressure, and under it my old certainties began to bend. I started to notice changes before she pointed them out. The way my reflection felt less like an opponent. The way being called by softer terms no longer made me flinch. The way my internal monologue shifted, questioning assumptions I had never examined. There were moments of panic, of course, nights when I lay awake wondering if I was losing myself. But even then, the fear felt intertwined with a strange relief, as if I were finally admitting something I had spent years avoiding. She never raised her voice. She never demanded. Yet somehow, her expectations became gravity. I found myself wanting to meet them, wanting to earn the approving nod she gave when I carried myself with intention. The dynamic unsettled me because it felt like surrender, but it also felt like alignment, like pieces clicking into place after a long, noisy search. The night she called me, she for the first time, it slipped out so naturally that neither of us acknowledged it right away. I felt the word ripple through me, a quiet shockwave that left warmth in its wake. She noticed my reaction, of course. She always did. Her eyes softened, and she said nothing more, allowing the silence to confirm what my heart was already beginning to accept. I didn't know then where this path would lead, only that stepping back felt harder than stepping forward. Loving her had become inseparable from listening to her, and listening to her had begun to change the way I heard myself. I was still standing at the edge of something vast, unsure whether to call it a loss or a becoming, but for the first time, the uncertainty didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like an invitation. I didn't notice the day my old habits stopped feeling neutral, only the day they began to feel wrong. It happened quietly, without ceremony, the way a room feels different after furniture has been moved while you were asleep. I would catch myself mid-gesture, mid-sentence, and feel a faint dissonance, like wearing shoes on the wrong feet. She never pointed it out when it happened. She only raised an eyebrow, or tilted her head, or waited until I corrected myself without prompting. When I did, her approval wasn't praise. It was recognition, and it settled over me like warmth. Spending time with her became less about visits and more about orbit. My schedule bent around hers without either of us nomming it. I found myself seeking her presence not for reassurance but for calibration, as if my internal compass only settled when I was near her. She had a way of asking questions that sounded casual but lingered for days. When do you feel most like yourself? What do you think strength actually looks like? Who taught you to be afraid of tenderness? Each one landed gently, and then unfolded slowly inside me, rearranging furniture I had never examined. She began assigning me small, almost absurd challenges. Not commands, never that, but expectations presented as inevitabilities. "Next time we go out," she said one afternoon, stirring her coffee, "you'll speak a little softer, not because you have to, because you can." The distinction mattered to her, and slowly it began to matter to me. I resisted at first, overcorrected, felt foolish. But then something surprising happened. The softer I spoke, the more people leaned in. The less space I claimed, the more deliberately I was seen. It unsettled me. It thrilled me. My reflection continued its slow betrayal. My posture shifted before my thoughts did. My expressions softened. I found myself caring about details I had once dismissed, how colors interacted, how words landed, how emotions registered on my face. She noticed everything. When I tried to downplay it, she smiled that knowing smile that made denial feel obsolete. "You're not changing," she said once, adjusting the collar of my coat. "You're allowing." There were moments when fear flared hot and fast. In public spaces, I worried about being perceived, about being misread, about crossing an invisible line I had been trained to police. She never dismissed those fears. She acknowledged them, named them, then placed them gently back into perspective. "Discomfort isn't danger," she reminded me. "It's information." Hearing her say it made the fear feel manageable, even useful, like a signal rather than a siren. Our dynamic deepened in ways I struggled to articulate. She began to guide rather than suggest, her confidence in my direction unwavering. When she corrected me, it wasn't criticism, it was refinement. When she praised me, it wasn't flattery, it was confirmation. I started to feel a pull toward pleasing her that went beyond affection. It was about alignment, about becoming someone who made sense in her presence. The word mistress drifted through my mind once, unbidden, and startled me with its resonance. Not in any lurid way, but as a recognition of authority freely given, of trust placed deliberately. She noticed my hesitation the first time I deferred to her in front of someone else, waiting for her cue before speaking. Later, alone, she asked why. I fumbled for an answer, expecting embarrassment. Instead, she nodded thoughtfully. "Because you trust my judgment," she said, "and because part of you wants permission to stop deciding everything alone." The relief I felt at her saying it was profound, almost dizzying. I hadn't realized how tired I was of constant self-surveillance, of measuring every action against an outdated blueprint. The changes became harder to compartmentalize. Friends commented on my demeanor, my energy, my calm. Some reacted with curiosity, others with confusion. A few drifted away, unable or unwilling to reconcile the shift. Each loss stung, but not as sharply as I'd feared. With every departure, there was also a lightness, as if shedding expectations I had been carrying on their behalf. She helped me mourn without romanticizing the pain. "Not everyone can walk with you through every door," she said. "That doesn't mean the door is wrong." At home, alone, I practiced being seen. I stood differently. I moved differently. I spoke my own name out loud, testing variations until one settled into place like it had been waiting. When I told her about it, my voice shaking, she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she smiled, not triumphantly, but tenderly. "I've been calling you that in my head for weeks," she admitted. "I was waiting for you to catch up." There were setbacks, days when the old reflexes surged back, when shame crept in disguised as nostalgia. She didn't scold me for those moments. She reminded me that growth wasn't a straight line, that resistance was often a sign of something important being challenged. "You don't owe consistency to your past," she said. "You owe honesty to your present." Each time she spoke like that, it felt like she was handing me a tool I didn't know I needed. By the time I realized how deeply her guidance had reshaped me, it no longer felt like an external force. It felt internalized, like a voice I had learned to trust because it spoke with clarity and care. I still struggled with labels, with what all of this meant in the larger narrative of my life, but the struggle itself had softened. I was no longer fighting myself. I was listening. One evening, as we walked side by side under streetlights that made everything look more cinematic than it had any right to, she glanced at me and said, "You know, you're carrying yourself like you believe you belong." The words hit me harder than any declaration could have. Belonging had always felt conditional, something granted temporarily if I performed correctly. Now it felt intrinsic, something I carried rather than borrowed. I didn't know yet how far this path would go, or how much more I would have to unlearn. I only knew that the person I was becoming felt less like a compromise and more like a homecoming, guided by someone who had seen this version of me long before I dared to imagine her myself. The moment I understood that there was no returning to who I had been came not during a dramatic confrontation or a tearful confession, but on a quiet morning when I reached for a sweater that no longer felt like it belonged to me. I held it in my hands, puzzled, not by its size or shape, but by the memory attached to it, as if it belonged to someone I used to know rather than someone I was. The realization startled me into stillness. I wasn't grieving. I wasn't panicking. I was simply done. And that calm finality frightened me more than fear ever had. She noticed the change before I said anything. She always did. That morning she studied me over breakfast, her gaze thoughtful, assessing not what I looked like but how I inhabited myself. "You're quieter today," she observed, not accusing, just nodding. I nodded, unsure how to explain the internal shift without cheapening it with inadequate language. She reached across the table, not to take my hand, but to turn my wrist slightly, aligning it the way she liked when I gestured. The correction was gentle, habitual now, and I felt the familiar ease of being guided settle into my bones. Our conversations grew deeper, less exploratory and more declarative. She spoke with increasing certainty about who I was becoming, and instead of bristling, I found myself relieved. There was comfort in her confidence, in the way she articulated things I had felt but never named. "You don't need to brace yourself anymore," she told me one afternoon as we walked through a park alive with early autumn light. "You're not on trial." The words loosened something in my chest, and I realized how long I had been holding my breath. Externally, the changes became harder to ignore. My appearance shifted in subtle but cumulative ways. Grooming habits refined themselves, choices became intentional rather than reactive. I noticed how my reflection responded to me now, no longer defiant or uncertain, but attentive, as if waiting for instruction. When strangers addressed me differently, hesitated, recalibrated, I felt a flicker of nerves followed by an unexpected steadiness. Each interaction became a quiet test of alignment, and more often than not, I passed without conscious effort. She began to introduce me to people differently, using language that nudged perception without forcing it. I watched reactions bloom in real time: confusion, curiosity, acceptance, occasionally discomfort. Each response taught me something about myself, about the world, about the elasticity of social scripts. When things went poorly, she didn't rush to rescue me. She debriefed with me later, calmly, analytically, helping me separate genuine harm from imagined catastrophe. "You're learning how to be visible," she reminded me. "Visibility always has a cost, but invisibility has one too." The authority she held in my life became unmistakable, not because she demanded it, but because I deferred without resentment. Decisions that once paralyzed me now felt lighter when filtered through her perspective. I began to seek her approval not out of insecurity, but out of respect. When she corrected me, I listened. When she praised me, it landed deeply. I realized that trust, once given fully, could feel like freedom rather than surrender. There were moments of pushback, of course. Old instincts don't disappear quietly. Sometimes I would catch myself arguing internally, rehearsing defenses for a self that no longer needed them. When I voiced these doubts, she didn't dismiss them. She welcomed them, examined them with me, then gently dismantled the parts that no longer served. "You're allowed to miss who you were," she said once, her voice steady, "but you don't have to live there." The permission to grieve without retreating was a gift I hadn't known to ask for. One evening, as we prepared to attend a small gathering, I hesitated in front of the mirror, adjusting details with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She watched from the doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Finally, she stepped forward and stilled my hands. "You're ready," she said simply. I looked at her, searching for doubt, for caution. There was none, only expectation. Not of perfection, but of presence. I took a breath and let my hands fall. At the gathering, something extraordinary happened. I forgot myself, not in the sense of disappearance, but in the sense of integration. I spoke when I wanted to speak, listened when I wanted to listen, moved through the space with a confidence that felt borrowed from a future I had already stepped into. When someone addressed me incorrectly, I corrected them without flinching. When someone complimented me, I accepted it without deflection. Later, she caught my eye across the room and nodded once. A subtle gesture that sent a surge of pride through me more potent than any applause. Afterward, walking home under a sky heavy with stars, I asked her when she had known. She didn't answer right away. She considered the question, weighing honesty against kindness. "I knew when you stopped performing and started responding," she said finally. "When your reactions became instinctive rather than strategic." I thought about that for a long time, turning it over in my mind until it clicked into place. I had spent years performing versions of myself, each one a negotiation. Now I was responding, living in real time, unbuffered. The word mistress surfaced again, this time spoken aloud, tentative but sincere. I watched her reaction carefully, expecting correction or hesitation. Instead, she smiled, slow and deliberate. "Only if you understand what that means," she replied. "It's not about control, it's about responsibility." The distinction mattered. I nodded, feeling the weight of the word settle into something solid and grounding. I trusted her to lead because she understood the terrain, not because she sought dominance for its own sake. As weeks turned into months, the life we built together felt less like a transformation and more like an unveiling. The challenges didn't vanish. Society didn't suddenly become gentle or accommodating, but my relationship to those challenges changed. I faced them with a clarity that surprised me, supported by a sense of self that no longer felt provisional. When doubt crept in, it found less room to spread. I began to imagine a future not as a distant abstraction, but as a continuation of the present. Plans took shape, goals aligned. The question shifted from, "Who am I allowed to be?" to "How fully can I inhabit who I already am?" The difference was subtle but seismic. She walked beside me through those realizations, neither pushing nor pulling, simply ensuring I didn't lose my footing as the ground reshaped itself beneath me. There were nights when I lay awake, replaying the journey, marveling at how something that began with curiosity had evolved into conviction. I no longer felt like I was being feminized by an external force. I felt like I was embracing a truth that had been patiently waiting, guided by someone who had seen it clearly long before I did. The love I felt for her was inseparable from the gratitude I felt for myself, for having taken the risk to follow where that love led. I knew there was more ahead, hard conversations, deeper commitments, moments of reckoning still to come. But the fear that once accompanied uncertainty had transformed into anticipation. I wasn't bracing for impact anymore. I was moving forward, deliberately, supported by a dynamic that felt chosen, earned, and profoundly right. I used to believe that identity announced itself in grand declarations, that one day you stood up and named yourself, and the world rearranged accordingly. What I learned instead was that identity seeps in, patient and persistent, until it saturates everything you touch. By the time I realized how completely my life had reoriented around her guidance, around the version of myself she had helped me uncover, it no longer felt like a revelation. It felt like remembering something I had once known and misplaced. The shift showed up most clearly in moments when she wasn't there. That surprised me. I had expected my confidence to falter without her steady presence, but instead I found her influence had rewired my internal landscape. When faced with decisions, I heard her questions in my mind, not as commands but as calibrations. What are you responding to? What feels aligned? What are you protecting and why? The answers came more easily than they ever had before, and they came without the familiar undertone of self-reproach. There were days when the outside world pushed back hard. Strangers stared too long. Conversations stalled in awkward recalibration. Institutions revealed their rigidity in small, exhausting ways. Each encounter tested the resilience I was still building. After one particularly difficult afternoon, I returned to her apartment carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken slights. I expected comfort, maybe reassurance. Instead, she listened, then asked a single question that cut through the noise. "Did any of that make you doubt who you are?" I considered it carefully, surprised to find the answer was no. The realization left me breathless. She nodded, satisfied. "Then they failed," she said simply. Our dynamic matured into something quieter but more profound. The early intensity gave way to a steadiness that felt unshakable. She didn't need to correct me as often. I had internalized the principles she had modeled. When she did intervene, it was precise and meaningful, like a sculptor refining details after the rough form has been established. Each adjustment reinforced the sense that this wasn't about changing me into something else, but about removing what had obscured me. I began to take up space in new ways, not louder or larger, but more deliberately. I learned the power of restraint, of listening fully before responding, of choosing presence over performance. People reacted differently to me now. Some were drawn in by the calm certainty I carried. Others were unsettled by it. I stopped trying to manage their reactions. That, more than anything, felt like freedom. One evening, as we sat together in comfortable silence, she remarked on how natural everything had become. "You're not asking for permission anymore," she observed. "You're choosing." The distinction mattered. I realized that what I had once feared as submission had evolved into agency informed by trust. I deferred to her not because I lacked direction, but because her perspective enhanced mine. The power dynamic that once felt charged with uncertainty now felt balanced, grounded in mutual respect and clarity of intent. There were moments of tenderness that had nothing to do with guidance or correction, shared laughter over mundane mishaps, quiet companionship during long walks, the simple comfort of being understood without explanation. These moments anchored the more challenging aspects of our journey, reminding me that transformation didn't require constant intensity to be real. Sometimes it was enough to exist side by side, aligned in purpose if not always in thought. I found myself mentoring others in small ways, offering the same patience and curiosity she had shown me. It felt important to pass along what I had learned, not as doctrine but as possibility. When someone confided their own uncertainties, I listened with the same attentiveness she had modeled, resisting the urge to fix or define. I understood now that growth couldn't be imposed. It had to be invited. Late one night, unable to sleep, I asked her if she ever worried about the influence she had on me. The question had been lingering unspoken for weeks. She considered it carefully before answering. "Influence is inevitable," she said. "What matters is whether it expands you or confines you." She met my gaze steadily. You're more expansive now. The truth of it settled deep, dissolving the last remnants of doubt I had been carrying. Looking back, I could trace the arc of my transformation not through milestones, but through shifts in perception. The way my body felt like home. The way my thoughts no longer turned against me. The way the future felt open rather than foreclosing. None of it had happened overnight. All of it had been earned through attention, courage, and an extraordinary willingness to be seen. As I drifted toward sleep that night, I understood that this journey wasn't nearing an end. It was stabilizing into a life, one shaped by conscious choice, sustained by trust, and illuminated by a love that had never demanded I become someone else, only that I stop hiding from who I already was. There's a kind of quiet that doesn't announce itself, a silence that arrives not because noise has stopped, but because conflict has finally stepped out of the room. I noticed it one morning while waiting for a bus, the glass shelter reflecting a faint, layered version of me against the waking city. Cars passed, people checked their phones, the air carried that early-hour mix of possibility and fatigue, and for once my mind wasn't racing ahead or circling backward. I wasn't rehearsing explanations. I wasn't editing myself for safety. I was simply standing there, balanced in my own body, breathing without commentary. The realization came softly, but it left me stunned. I had lived so long in a state of internal debate that peace felt almost unreal, like a trick of the light. By then, the transformation was no longer something I could chart with milestones. It wasn't a list of changes or a sequence of decisions. It was a texture, a way of being that had settled into my muscles and nerves. I noticed it in small, unremarkable moments, how I adjusted my coat without thinking, how my expression responded naturally instead of defensively, how my voice carried a warmth that didn't feel borrowed or performed. These weren't acts anymore. They were defaults. And with that realization came a strange mix of pride and humility, because I knew I hadn't arrived here through willpower alone. Her presence had become something less visible but more fundamental, like gravity. We didn't need constant conversations about identity or direction now. Those foundations had already been laid. Instead, our discussions drifted toward the substance of living, how to handle disappointment without retreating, how to show up consistently even when motivation waned, how to align daily choices with deeper values. She expected coherence from me now. Not obedience, not performance, but integrity. When my actions slipped into old patterns of fear or overcompensation, she noticed immediately. She wouldn't scold or lecture. She would simply observe, "That didn't sound like you," and the words would land with surgical precision. I didn't feel ashamed when she said it. I felt oriented, like a compass snapping back to north. There was an afternoon when someone from my past reached out, unsettled by what they perceived as a sudden, incomprehensible change. Their concern came wrapped in confusion, nostalgia, and a subtle insistence that I explain myself in terms they could accept. In another version of my life, I would have folded inward, softened my truth to preserve their comfort. This time, I listened carefully. I acknowledged their feelings without absorbing them. I spoke plainly, without defensiveness or apology, choosing honesty over persuasion. When the conversation ended, I realized my hands weren't shaking. My breathing was steady. I hadn't disappeared inside myself. Later, when I told her about it, she listened closely and then smiled, not with triumph but with recognition. "You stayed present," she said. "You didn't abandon yourself to make it easier." That mattered more to me than any external approval ever had. Experiences like that accumulated quietly, each one reinforcing a sense of self that no longer felt conditional. I began to trust my instincts, not because I believed they were perfect, but because they were finally aligned with my values. When I made mistakes, I corrected them without spiraling. When doubt surfaced, it moved through me like weather rather than settling into a permanent climate. I understood something fundamental then. Resilience wasn't about hardness or endurance. It was about flexibility anchored in self-knowledge, the ability to bend without breaking because you know where you stand. Our relationship evolved alongside me, deepening into something that resisted easy labels. She was still my guide, my chosen authority in many respects, the person whose perspective I trusted enough to defer to when clarity mattered. But there was also partnership now, an easy exchange of ideas, shared laughter over small absurdities, mutual reliance that felt earned rather than assumed. The power dynamic that once felt electric and uncertain had stabilized into something sustainable. I followed her lead not because I doubted myself, but because I respected her discernment. She led not because she needed control, but because she cared about the outcome. The balance required constant attentiveness, but it no longer felt fragile. It felt alive. One evening, during a long, reflective conversation, she asked me to describe myself without referencing who I used to be. The request seemed simple until I tried to answer it. My first attempts leaned heavily on contrast, on what I had shed or escaped. She stopped me gently, her expression patient but firm. "No comparisons," she said. "Just tell me who you are." I closed my eyes and took a breath, letting the noise settle. When I spoke again, the words came slower, but they came from a place that felt solid and unguarded. I talked about what mattered to me now, about how I moved through the world, about the values I refused to negotiate. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then she nodded once. "That sounds like someone who knows herself," she said. The word didn't catch this time. It fit. The world, of course, hadn't magically become accommodating. There were still systems that lagged behind understanding, spaces that demanded explanations I no longer felt obligated to provide. But I learned to choose my battles with intention. I stopped measuring my success by how well I could educate or persuade others. She reminded me often that visibility was a tool, not a requirement. "You don't owe everyone access," she said. "You owe yourself honesty." That reframing changed how I navigated public spaces, granting me a sense of agency that felt both protective and expansive. One of the most profound changes, and the hardest to articulate, was how my body felt to inhabit. Not just how it appeared, but how it responded to me. There was a familiarity there now, a sense of cooperation rather than conflict. Sensations registered clearly, unfiltered by self-consciousness. I treated myself with care not as a project or a proof, but as a matter of course. This, more than anything, felt like the real transformation. Not the external markers others could point to, but the internal relationship I had finally repaired. Late one night, during one of those conversations that stretch without agenda, she asked me if I was still afraid. The question lingered in the air, gentle but direct. I considered it carefully, scanning my inner landscape with the honesty she had taught me. Fear still existed, of course, but it no longer dominated. It no longer dictated. "I'm careful," I said finally, "but I'm not afraid of myself." She reached for my hand then, a rare, deliberate gesture, and squeezed it once. "That was always the goal," she said softly. In that moment, I understood just how intentional she had been from the very beginning. Not manipulative, not coercive, purposeful. She had seen a version of me that I couldn't access on my own and had created a space where that version could emerge without being overwhelmed. The responsibility she carried as my mistress, yes, the word felt settled and accurate now, had never been about reshaping me into her image. It had been about holding a steady vision while I learned how to meet it myself. The realization filled me with a gratitude, so deep it bordered on reverence. As weeks turned into seasons, my life settled into a rhythm that felt both ordinary and quietly extraordinary. Work, friendships, routines, moments of joy that didn't announce themselves but accumulated into contentment. The drama I had once associated with identity receded, replaced by a steady sense of rightness. I didn't feel finished. I felt ongoing, engaged in a process that no longer needed constant narration to be real. Sometimes I would catch my reflection unexpectedly, in a window, a mirror, a darkened screen, and smile, not out of pride or performance but recognition. The person looking back at me wasn't a compromise or a construction. She was me, present and integrated, shaped by trust, guided by care, and finally at peace with herself. And in that recognition, I felt a quiet certainty that whatever came next, I would meet it whole. I remember the morning sunlight slipping through the curtains and spilling across the room like liquid gold, and I realized that this light, warm and gentle, was not merely a signal of a new day. It was the illumination of everything I had become. I had never understood how quiet a home could feel when it is filled with completeness rather than tension. The air smelled faintly of lavender, the scent lingering in a way that made every breath feel like an embrace, and I felt the almost surreal serenity of being awake in a body, in a self, that no longer wavered under the weight of fear or shame. For years, I had moved through my life as though it were a series of performances, trying to fit into boxes that were never made for me, gauging the reactions of others as though their perception could validate my existence. But now, standing in front of the mirror, I saw a self that existed without apology, a self who had endured, questioned, explored, and finally arrived at a place of quiet, unwavering certainty. Her presence was immediate and grounding. Alex had been there from the first trembling experiment with a dress I had once thought impossible to wear, guiding my hands, steadying my breath, offering quiet encouragement that was never pushy but always insistent in its tenderness. She had seen the hesitation in my eyes, the tension that threaded through every movement, the longing and the fear that wrestled for dominance within me, and she had never once turned away. She had been patient, attentive, unshakably supportive, and in that patience she had taught me the most profound lesson, that the self is not born fully formed, but cultivated through love, trust, and fearless exploration. And now, as I watched her sit across from me, sipping her tea, the sunlight catching the strands of her hair like threads of amber, I understood that our bond had become something far greater than mentorship or friendship. It was a shared journey of transformation, of revelation, of embracing the possibilities of the self without reservation. I traced the lines of my reflection, every curve, every softened angle, every expression of a body that had been both an instrument and a canvas, and I marveled at the subtle ways in which the years of careful attention, patient self-exploration, and gentle encouragement had reshaped me. I had learned not to fight the sensations of vulnerability, the subtle tremors of self-doubt that occasionally surfaced, but to recognize them as markers of growth, indicators that I was moving forward rather than hiding. I had discovered that true confidence does not erase uncertainty, it lives alongside it, allowing one to move with grace and courage even when fear lingers in the shadows. And as I inhaled deeply, feeling the rise and fall of my chest, the warmth in my limbs, and the smoothness of the fabrics that hugged my frame in a way that was no longer foreign but intimately familiar, I realized that I had finally arrived at a version of myself that was whole, not fractured, not shadowed by the hesitation that had once defined me. Alex spoke softly, almost as if she were testing the air for my reaction. "You've grown so much," she said, and in those words there was no judgment, no comparison, only recognition, a mirror held up not to perfection, but to the truth of who I had become. I felt the words settle into me, a gentle affirmation that traveled beyond logic and reason into the deep recesses of my heart, filling spaces I had not known were empty. Every touch, every glance, every quiet reassurance over the years had built toward this moment, a convergence of experience, trust, and self-acceptance that left me feeling simultaneously fragile and indestructible. I understood now that transformation is not a single act or a singular revelation. It is a lifetime of small, deliberate choices, of daring to meet one's reflection with curiosity rather than fear, and of allowing oneself to be seen fully, wholly, and without reservation. We moved through the day with a deliberate slowness, each movement a meditation on presence. When I stood by the window, watching the city hum below, I felt the thrill of recognition in every detail. The way sunlight fractured on the glass, the subtle shadows that stretched along the walls, the distant sounds of life that reminded me that I was part of a world larger than the confines of my own anxieties. Alex and I spoke little at first. Our communication carried as much in silence as it was in words, a language that had evolved through countless hours of shared exploration and trust. Each gesture, each fleeting smile, each touch of her hand as she adjusted a strand of my hair or brushed a trace of powder from my cheek was both ordinary and extraordinary, simultaneously intimate and grounding. I realized that these moments were the culmination of everything that had brought me here. Every experiment with identity, every late-night conversation, every tremor of doubt and hesitation that had been met with patience and encouragement rather than judgment. I sat down across from her, hands folded, and allowed myself to reflect, not just on the journey of transformation in appearance, but on the deeper evolution that had taken place within me. I remembered the nights of fear, the mornings of uncertainty, the tentative first steps into a world that had once seemed impossibly rigid. I remembered the first time I had put on a dress under her guidance, the trembling mixture of excitement and terror that had pulsed through me, and the sensation of finally, tentatively, recognizing a fragment of myself that had always existed but had never been acknowledged. I thought of every moment of doubt and hesitation and realized that they were not failures but necessary steps, each one building toward a foundation strong enough to support the self I now inhabited. Hours passed like moments. We shared tea, conversations, laughter, and comfortable silence, and in each of these I recognized a truth that had taken years to internalize. Identity is not something that can be measured by clothing, by appearance, or by the judgments of others. It is a living, breathing negotiation between the self and the world, between fear and courage, between doubt and acceptance. And I had learned, finally, how to inhabit that negotiation with grace, patience, and joy. I had learned to recognize that the self we hide from the world is often the self most deserving of acknowledgement, care, and celebration. As evening approached and the light shifted from gold to soft amber, I caught my reflection once more. This time, I saw not just a body or a face or an external transformation, but a narrative etched into every line, every curve, every expression. A history of resilience, trust, patience, and love. I saw the moments of fear that had once threatened to define me, now tempered and contextualized by growth. I saw the countless hours of gentle guidance and companionship. The quiet insistence that I recognize my worth, the patient modeling of confidence, care, and grace. And I understood with a clarity that left me breathless that transformation is not merely an act, it is a lifelong engagement with the self, a practice of self-compassion, courage, and authenticity. When Alex reached for my hand, and our fingers intertwined, I felt the quiet power of shared experience ripple through me. In her presence, I realized that identity, love, and acceptance are not linear or finite. They are iterative, evolving, and endlessly complex. I had been guided, yes, but I had also guided myself, discovering in the process a well of courage, resilience, and self-awareness that had always been present, waiting to be acknowledged. And in that acknowledgement, I felt something I had never felt before. A profound, unshakable peace, a sense of completeness that transcended the external, a serenity that reached into the core of my being and whispered a truth I could finally embrace. I am wholly, unapologetically myself. We watched the sun set, the city below fading into a tapestry of lights, and I allowed myself to dwell in the quiet intensity of the moment. It was not just an ending, nor merely a beginning. It was a culmination, a celebration, a recognition of the totality of everything that had come before and the infinite possibilities that lay ahead. I realized that the journey I had undertaken, guided by love, patience, and courage, was a microcosm of life itself, complex, demanding, beautiful, and endlessly rewarding. And I understood, finally, that the self is not a fixed entity but a living, breathing construct shaped by experience, trust, exploration, and courage. As night fell and the world outside hushed into a gentle rhythm, I looked at Alex, smiled, and felt a profound gratitude that transcended words. I had been transformed not just in appearance, but in heart, mind, and soul. I had been challenged, guided, loved, and finally, I had arrived at a place of wholeness. And in that wholeness, I knew something unshakable, eternal, and deeply liberating. The self we fear to reveal is often the self most deserving of love, care, and celebration. I was no longer hiding, no longer fractured, no longer tentative. I was whole, alive, radiant, and finally free.